Hello. Yes. Can I ask a few questions about the apartment on Park Street?
What was your name?
My name is Juan Hernandez.
It's been rented.
Oh, it's gone. Hello, my name is Sanjay Kumar. I am calling about the apartment on Park Street.
It's not available.
Not available? Hello, my name is Tyrone Washington. I'm calling about the apartment on Park Street.
Just been rented.
Hello, I am Chen Ling. My name is Khalid Ali. I'm Tuan Vo. Hello, my name is Moshe Goldberg. I use a wheelchair. It's gone. Not available. All right. Thank you. Yes, hello, my name is Graham Wellington. I'm calling about the apartment for rent on Park Street. Is that still available?
Yes, it is.
Oh, it is?
Yes.
Really?
The PSA you just viewed may seem unrealistic, but the harsh reality is that segregation continues throughout the country and is extremely blatant in Fairfield County real estate. Think about your neighbors, your classmates. Think about where you live, the vacations you take, the cars you own, the colleges you will attend, and the luxuries you take for granted. Think about our neighbors in Bridgeport. Did they have these same privileges? This separation of whites and minorities has been an issue since the founding of the United States. Steps have been taken to put an end to these inequalities, but while real estate legislation was designed to promote equality and end de facto segregation, these policies have been unsuccessful because of loopholes in the language and lack of enforcement. As a result, segregation has persisted throughout the modern age. Still, before we examine the contemporary effects of housing discrimination, we must understand where the problem started.
I moved in this house in 1957. It was mostly a white area, and when they said that the niggers was coming, they didn't say black, they said the niggers was coming. And they start moving away.
Following the Civil War, blacks were often barred through legal and/or financial means from purchasing property. Post-war Reconstruction consisted of mass efforts to unify the country while still implementing changes brought on by the conflict, such as abolition. The Freedmen's Bureau was the driving force behind these efforts and attempted to help the newly freed African Americans with practical aid in areas such as education, healthcare, and shelter. However, the Bureau's power was limited as white lawmakers, many of them overtly racist, prioritized other federal projects and even tried to curb Reconstruction efforts. Usually, schools built under Reconstruction reforms were far below the standards of their white counterparts. Similarly, housing conditions were barely meeting, if not falling below, the bare minimum. Blacks who did relocate into neighborhoods set up by the Freedmen's Bureau were unquestionably at a disadvantage in comparison to their white neighbors. To heighten the issue, the nation, specifically the South, reverted to its racist pre-war ways as Andrew Johnson refused to consider pro-Reconstruction proposals made by radical Republicans. While Johnson was nearly impeached in 1868, his presidency set the stage for future local and federal politicians to further restrict the few rights African Americans had.
Hi, this is Katie. Another key part of this is historical discrimination in real estate markets, and particularly how that affects purchasing power in future generations. So historically, obviously there was a lot of really overt racial discrimination that prevented blacks from moving into predominantly white communities. And in fact, there were government subsidies dating back to the 1930s that were really only available for white families and allowed white families during that time period to purchase homes. Homes are the most valuable thing most people own, and they're really valuable when people are able to pass on that wealth to future generations. And so home ownership rates turn out to be one of the key drivers of racial wealth gaps. So the median black family, I think, has something like $9,000 in wealth, and the median white family, again, this depends on what year you're looking at statistics, but has a median wealth of $60,000. And so because of these historical patterns of racial discrimination in real estate markets, you have vastly different purchasing powers by racial group today. And so when groups have very different levels of wealth available to them, they necessarily are going to have to live in different neighborhoods because certain groups are not going to be able to afford communities.
Almost 30 years after the turn of the century, laws were still in place which allowed homeowners to include a clause in the deed of their property that prevented black people from purchasing it.
And then also the social connotation, the social issue of like who is moving next to me, who is moving to the neighborhood.
These deeds served as a significant barrier to integration and provoked controversy serious enough to earn them the spotlight in two Supreme Court cases over the course of more than 2 decades: Corrigan v. Buckley in 1926 and Shelley v. Kramer in 1948. In the former, the court upheld the legality of a covenant preventing blacks from buying property in a neighborhood in Washington, D.C. Ironically, the defendant, Irene Corrigan, had signed this covenant in 1921 and, just 1 year later, broke her promise when she contracted to sell her home to Helen Curtis, a black woman. Corrigan's neighbor attempted to sue her for violating their agreement, and the case reached the Supreme Court in 1926. Here, Chief Justice William Taft ruled that blocking the covenant was unconstitutional. All in all, his decision served as a major setback to the push for integration. In 1948, however, Taft's decision was virtually overturned in Shelley v. Kramer. J.D. Shelley, a black man, actually managed to purchase a home in St. Louis despite a discriminatory covenant signed by most homeowners in the neighborhood. As a housewarming gift, his new neighbors tried to get the sale reversed. Still, Shelley held his ground, and the case made it all the way to the Supreme Court, which, this time, ruled that enforcing a covenant was unconstitutional. Although the Fair Housing Act would not be ratified for another 20 years, Shelley's victory foreshadowed the fall of de jure racial segregation. The first step toward racial integration in housing came in the form of a fight to end redlining. Outlawed in 1968 under the Fair Housing Act, this practice began during the national mortgage crisis that came to define the Great Depression. As the real estate industry plummeted to an all-time low, banks gave out fewer mortgages and were forced to choose which neighborhoods they insured. Consequently, they would draw different colored lines to create zones on a map. These zones signified where the bank would invest based on an area's financial stability and racial composition. For example, Zone A, or the green zone, represented in-demand areas with high-income white residents. Unsurprisingly, the Federal Housing Administration, designed to stabilize real estate during the Great Depression, almost always insured these areas. Zone B represented areas that had reached their peak of desirability, but were expected to remain stable for many years. There were few minorities in these areas, and the FHA would often support them. Zone C represented neighborhoods that were on the decline. These neighborhoods had an even mix of whites and minorities and rarely received loans. Lastly, Zone D, or the red zone, represented areas in which the population consisted mainly of low-income minorities. Inevitably, red zones were considered to be the worst for loan repayment and thus experienced no mortgage backing.
Other kinds of redlining where lenders will say, we are not going to lend in this community, or we're not going to lend, and they do that. They don't do it so bluntly now, but they will say, well, we're not going to lend. In order to get a mortgage, it has to be over $100,000. We don't lend anything lower than that. But if you have a neighborhood with most houses at $80,000, then you're out of luck because the bank doesn't lend there.
In his 2006 book Sundown Towns, James Lowen analyzed FHA publications which implied that different races should not share neighborhoods. One blatant example of this discrimination can be found in documents describing a case that occurred in Detroit in 1941. Here, the FHA denied a neighborhood divided by 8 Mile Road insurance because it was supposedly home to, quote, disharmonious racial groups, end quote. Less than a year later, a white real estate developer built a concrete wall segregating 8 Mile, and suddenly the FHA was happy to insure the now isolated white neighborhood. The Detroit example was, unfortunately, not uncommon. Similar FHA actions stripped many inner cities of their middle-class inhabitants who could afford insurance but were blocked from it by redlining. Without a middle class, predominantly minority neighborhoods quickly decayed. Even loans for the repair of existing structures were rarely granted, meaning families could more easily purchase a new home than modernize an old one. Because of this, many older inner-city properties were abandoned. Today, the United States continues to struggle with an urban housing crisis. Cities have become more attractive to millennials who, collectively, wait longer to marry and start a family than their parents once had. However, while demand for a place in the city grows, supply does not. As a result, property values have risen in cities across the country, especially coastal ones like New York and San Francisco. The influx of wealthy renters is arguably beneficial to neighborhoods previously considered slums. However, the advent of these trendy, gentrified communities also buries low-income, often minority citizens by pricing them out of their homes. In the words of New York Times journalist John Tierney, housing shortages cause poor people to suffer the most.
A rental apartment, and you may not know that you're being discriminated against.
For instance, the average price for an apartment in New York City is $4,000 per month, and the city's average monthly income is only $4,200. Therefore, the average New Yorker would have a mere $200 to spend on utilities, food, transportation, and entertainment. Clearly, this is not an attainable price point for most people in New York City. Unfortunately, the issue of gentrification does not just end there. Cities have ultimately begun to lose a lot of the diversity that once defined them. When groups of minorities leave an area, their languages, customs, traditions, art, and religion goes with them. All of these unique characteristics are instead replaced with a homogeneous group of people who lack cultural or family ties to the neighborhood, but rather were driven there by their job. In reality, little has been done to combat the negative effects of gentrification. While public and private organizations alike have been created to protect citizens, like those being displaced in New York and San Francisco, they often fail to serve their purpose. The United States Department of Housing and Urban Development, or HUD, was founded in 1968 and tasked with enforcing the anti-discrimination laws outlined in the Fair Housing Act. The creation of HUD marked a significant shift toward federal recognition of civil rights issues. However, the agency has struggled for decades to fully prevent racial discrimination in common real estate practice.
Well, there's a couple things. People don't know what to report.
Right. Yeah.
They just don't know where to go. They don't know what constitutes discrimination.
In 2007, Shanna Smith, the president of the National Fair Housing Alliance, testified that 4 million cases of housing discrimination occur every year. Of those 4 million cases, only 30,000 are reported to HUD. Of those 30,000 cases reported to HUD, only 31 lead to prosecution. This means that 3,999,969 violations of the Fair Housing Act are left unaddressed. For those of you who think in terms of proportions, HUD is serving its purpose 775 ten-thousandths of a percent of the time. To put this in perspective, you are 6 times more likely to die at the hands of an asteroid than HUD is to charge a case of housing discrimination. When we tried to contact HUD to ask them about these statistics, they refused and instead replied with scripted, somewhat alarming answers.
Them all the time, so yeah, they're very
Official
and by the book, and the reports are like you have to report on absolutely everything you do, and it's working with HUD is fun.
Although HUD's enforcement record is statistically abysmal, many of the department's shortcomings admittedly stem from limitations set in place by politicians almost 50 years ago. Like much of the legislation we have studied this year, the Fair Housing Act contains language that makes enforcement difficult. Loopholes and omissions allow realtors to perpetuate de facto segregation while evading legal ramifications. The most commonly exploited of these loopholes can be found in Section 805 of the Fair Housing Act. Can you identify how the language of the appraisal exemption leaves certain individuals prone to discrimination?
Oh, we'll never find it now, Dora. Sure we will, Boots. Let's stop and think.
Specifies that individuals may not be denied housing on the basis of race, color, national origin, etc., it fails to protect those with low incomes. Consequently, realtors can legally neglect to show clients certain houses and claim that they are doing so because of the client's financial situation. Essentially, realtors can say,
No, I wasn't discriminating against this individual based on their racial background. It's just that, they don't have a stable job, so I'm worried that their employment history isn't as long, so they're not going to be as stable a tenant as this other individual who has a much lengthier employment history. So yeah, I think it makes it much easier to engage in racial discrimination.
I didn't show that family the house because their credit and financial history isn't reliable, not because they're a minority. Unfortunately, it is almost impossible to prove what realtors were really thinking.
The real problem is as long as race and income are so closely tied, it's even if you had an administration who is deeply committed to getting rid of housing discrimination, I think it's so incredibly difficult to prove because all of these things are so closely related.
As a result, this justification usually works in their favor. We have dubbed this the income excuse. Of course, white buyers can also be discriminated against for their financial status, but according to a U.S. Census report published in 2013, only 11.6% of white Americans live in poverty, compared to 25.8% of blacks and 21.25% of Hispanics. This gap between poverty rates means that the income excuse can be used far more often to deprive non-white clients of equal housing opportunities. This then causes the Fair Housing Act to become problematic for those trying to enforce it and puts minorities at a disadvantage by failing to clarify that realtors cannot discriminate on the basis of income. Proponents of the Fair Housing Act may argue that there is no reason to show clients properties that they cannot afford. At a glance, this may seem logical, but in reality, a client's lawful income presented to realtors is often less than the actual funds available to them. Many people living below the poverty line receive Social Security, child support, and/or other forms of financial aid that do not count toward their income, but can be used to make rent or mortgage payments. Since minorities are disproportionately dependent upon these forms of welfare, they are once again put at a disadvantage.
My income is, I get public assistance, or I have a part-time job, or I have a low-income job, and I get food stamps. Versus somebody who has a regular job and is not getting any assistance. A landlord might prefer that.
Recently, another loophole in housing legislation has become especially conspicuous with the growth of gentrification in coastal cities. Landlords want to profit off of rising property values, so they will try to evict low-income tenants paying cheap rent and replace them with wealthier, prospective renters.
Might not be in the best livable conditions. That's one of them. Repairs need to happen, but they don't happen right away as they're supposed to. They can they can take advantage of it by imposing sometimes a specific fees for certain things, that might be excessive.
In San Francisco's Mission District, this practice has been especially harmful to low-income minorities. Although landlords cannot evict tenants who are diligently paying their rent, they often take advantage of California's Ellis Act, which legalizes evictions under the condition that the property is being taken off of the rental market. Landlords will claim that they need the property for a family member or themselves, evict the tenant on this basis, and then, years later, put the property back on market without any improvements, but at a much higher price. In the Mission District, this resulted in 1,222 eviction notices being issued over a span of 4 years. Unsurprisingly, Latinos suffered disproportionately from these evictions. The Latino population decreased by 6% over the last 35 years in Mission, while, on the other hand, the white population increased by 7%. Overall, laws like the Fair Housing Act often fail to prevent racial discrimination in housing policy because of omissions and ambiguous language that makes enforcement difficult.
There's been a lot of research that shows that realtors, in a variety of very subtle ways, will steer Black and Hispanic prospective home buyers and prospective renters to communities that are predominantly Black and Hispanic, and they steer them away from white neighborhoods. And they'll do it, again, in sort of subtle ways.
As a result, realtors get away with adhering to bias and even covert racism when making sales to non-white clients. Of course, the ramifications of discriminatory real estate policies go well beyond politics and even the economy. Realtors have a profound influence over the social aspect of clients' lives. By systematically confining minority families to low-income neighborhoods, realtors are also systematically confining children to schools that are underfunded through a lack of substantial property taxes. Without a substantial education budget, these schools hire unqualified teachers and usually report lower academic achievement rates than their counterparts in wealthier neighborhoods. Additionally, schools with high percentages of students in poverty are likely to have less experienced teachers and higher staff turnover. And before teaching can even begin, those teachers must also cope with a range of issues relating to their students' families' low income, including lack of adequate clothing, food, or housing.
All right, what is your name?
Josue.
Cool. Do you live in Bridgeport?
Yeah.
Hi, my name is Madonna and I live in Bridgeport too.
Okay, cool. How do you guys like going to Bassick?
It's fine.
It's fun?
Fine.
Yeah. What makes it just fun?
I mean, it's not all that, but it's fun.
How about you?
My classmates make me happy.
Your classmates make you happy? All right, that's good.
Teachers too.
I'm sorry?
The teachers too.
Okay, really?
Yeah.
All right, that's awesome. Good.
Do you guys feel like safe going to school?
Not every day, but some days, yeah.
Why don't you feel safe sometimes?
Because I I know the people around me, like how they live and what they have in their bags, what they could do.
Did something happen here like a couple of days ago?
Yeah, it was a fight.
Can you guys talk about that? Like what happened?
I mean, all I know is they broke the window.
They broke the window?
Yeah.
Which one?
It has like cardboard in front of it. Like,
That's
I mean,
so
back
good.
behind it.
Oh my god.
I was there, kind of got pushed, actually.
Are you
'cause
serious?
I was kind of being myself nosy, and I kind of walked into the classroom and I got pushed back, and then, yeah.
What happened?
Yikes.
So, supposedly two different, like, I think it was like gangs, kind of like groups. It was like a boyfriend and a boyfriend and a girl and a girl.
Yeah.
It's like, they were beefing, and like, they just fought, and then they got like let out of the classroom too.
Did any like teachers try to stop it?
Yeah.
A bunch of teachers,
Yeah,
and a bunch of
teachers,
security guards.
security
I
guards.
think all the security guards are still there. And they're still
Everyone was
there.
there.
Cheers were thrown and everything.
Yeah, we heard about the chair thing. I didn't even know.
I mean,
oh my god.
And like the learning experience is like really wonderful. Like
Let's
that's why
go.
people think it's the education that's bad, but it's honestly just the kids.
It's just the kids.
The kids. Do you think it's because like of where you live or like how like you grow up,
I think it's your environment, yeah.
environment?
Like home life and coming from.
Yeah. And they like, I feel like they have bad influences and stuff.
Right, so it's just like it'll be like a couple kids and then it'll kind of be like a domino effect in your school.
Okay, that makes sense.
This modern-day example of separate and unequal has been quantified too. According to the National Center for Education Statistics, white children attend schools where black children, on average, make up 9% of the population. Meanwhile, black children attend schools where they make up roughly 48% of the population. In an analysis of this study, the school with the higher black population recorded that students of both races did not perform as well as those who attended the predominantly white school. Based on this data, where a student lives has a greater effect on his or her educational success than the student's racial background does. Students living in neighborhoods mainly consisting of minorities simply do not perform as well because their schools are more likely to be underfunded. The federal government has taken steps to address these educational inequalities, but their efforts have, as a whole, been deemed unsuccessful due to a lack of enforcement. For instance, the Head Start program, created in 1965, was designed to cut off the roots of the achievement gap by providing low-income families with opportunities to send their children to preschool. Unfortunately, minority students still graduate with an average literacy rate 4 years behind that of their white counterparts. After high school, these minority students work lower-paying jobs with lower qualifications and rent homes in low-income neighborhoods. As a result, their children attend underfunded schools, and the cycle repeats itself. On the state level, Connecticut has actually made significant attempts to put an end to this cycle through the creation of the Achievement Gap Task Force. This organization not only offers extra help to low-income, typically minority students in the classroom, but also works with their families to educate their parents or guardians and improve their lives at home. While the Achievement Gap Task Force has followed through with many of its ambitious programs, it is unlikely that they will meet their goal of closing the gap by 2020. Overall, despite the promises of legislation and even organizations, the effects of housing discrimination remain prominent. This begs the question, what can be done to make sure that realtors and landlords adhere to their code of ethics?
I think the federal government should invest more in doing audit studies to see whether blacks, whites, and Latinos and Asians all have equal access to mortgages.
The simplest answer is to increase enforcement of the Fair Housing Act. This constitutes more punishment for realtors discriminating against clients and more education about the rights of low-income, minority, prospective buyers or renters vulnerable to manipulation. Unfortunately, President Trump has expressed disdain for many of Obama's solutions, especially those seeking to do just this.
I think if we're sort of portraying the Department of Housing and Urban Development as probably being less likely to be of help to cities and the poor and people seeking housing, I think that's clearly going to be the case under the current presidential administration.
The Trump administration has also threatened to cut HUD funding by $8 billion in a new budget proposal. If passed, this would make enforcement more difficult than it already is. After watching the following clip, maybe you'll understand why Trump so staunchly opposes anti-discriminatory real estate laws.
14,000 apartments in 39 different buildings, all mostly white tenants. That is until the Department of Justice took notice in 1973 and slammed Donald Trump and his father Fred Trump with a lawsuit. Trump management was charged with discriminating against African Americans and breaking federal law. Donald Trump, then just 27, was president of the company. The Department of Justice accused the Trumps of violating the Fair Housing Act, arguing they were turning away renters based on race and color. Who tipped them off? Local activists, so-called testers, posing as potential renters at Trump's buildings, mainly in Brooklyn and Queens.
The future of housing discrimination seems bleak, making it especially important to understand the issues past. Would you allow an agency to deny you a mortgage because of who lives near you? Would you stand to see your longtime neighbor displaced as wealthy realtors steal the diverse culture away from their cities? Would you be frustrated if you reported cases like these, but nothing was done? As many of us were born and raised in the nation's Gold Coast, we often overlook the blatant segregation that exists today. Hopefully, this video serves as an eye-opener.